Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much again for joining today's training. This training is presented by Switchboard, which is a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. My name is Meg Gibbon and I'm Switchboard's Program Officer for Learning and Knowledge Management. Before we dive into the content on today's training, Refugee Adult Education, Improving Participation, Partnerships, and Program Design, I'm just going to run through a few logistics in Zoom. So all the attendees are currently muted. This reminder is just here for you at any time if you'd like to switch from phone to computer or vice versa. You have the audio settings in the bottom left with the dial-in number. We would love to hear your comments, your questions throughout today's session. We'll take those during Q&A at the end. To access the chat, there should be a bubble at the bottom center of your screen. When you open the chat, you can send your message to all panelists and all attendees so that everybody on the call is able to view your message. And to test that out now, some of you have already done this in the chat. Anyone who's attending today with multiple colleagues but using a single computer, if you're in a conference room or boardroom, go ahead and type your names and your organization here in the chat so we know who's joining today. You also have the Q&A as an option, which I'll flag to you. That's just another way to send in content, but sometimes the chat is easiest, so you can feel free to stick to that. And then lastly, to request the ability to unmute your line, you can click the hand icon in the bottom center. During the Q&A, we will call on anyone whose hand is raised and allow you to ask your question. We won't open that up until the end. One thing I should mention too before introducing today's speaker is that today's training is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the Switchboard website and you will receive a link to the recording over email in exactly 24 hours, so please keep an eye out for that email. I'm so pleased to introduce today's speaker, Erica Bouris, Senior Technical Advisor for Economic Empowerment at the International Rescue Committee. Erica supports the implementation of economic empowerment programs in nearly 30 communities across the U.S., and she brings a particular focus on workforce programming, including youth and adult programs, career pathways programs, innovative models of vocational ESL, and of course, adult education. So over to you, Erica.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be joining you today for our webinar. I will go ahead and get started. We have 4 specific learning objectives for today, and I just wanted to take a quick minute to review those at the beginning, and then we'll move right into our content. So the first goal we have today is to really talk through the main challenges that refugees face in accessing adult education, and we're going to kind of look at that through 2 different lenses. Next, we want to make sure that everyone is capable of identifying strategies to address barriers to accessing adult education programs. So we want to highlight some of those challenges and, of course, then identify strategies to mitigate those challenges. Next, we're going to spend some time talking about the way in which resettlement agencies and CBOs and other refugee service providers can work together with adult education providers to improve programming and offer relevant, responsive programming that meets the needs of refugees. Lastly, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how we can fund adult education programming, and we'll have a few minutes to kind of go through some very specific opportunities in that area. So next slide, please. Great, so you can kind of see our agenda here. I think I kind of just went through it directly, but we will go ahead and move on to the next slide and jump right into barriers. We'd like to get our conversation started today by hearing from you about some of the barriers that you see refugees facing in accessing adult education. So if you want to take a quick moment to identify some of those barriers by typing them in the chat, that would be great. All right, so I'm seeing transportation and childcare. I think those are barriers we're all very familiar with. Lots and lots of transportation, indeed, in many of our communities. We see language. I assume that means kind of level of English. More comments about classes not being close by, transportation issues. Indeed, I see someone flagging mental health as a challenge. Yeah, some of our clients might not be in a position where they're quite ready to participate in adult education. And lots of comments about transportation. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you for all of those really good ideas. We're going to kind of move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about some of these in more depth, as well as a few that we haven't yet seen pop up in the chat box. So when we think about barriers to accessing adult education programs, I think we can, one way we can have that conversation is to talk about kind of the usual suspects that I think indeed were the first ones that popped up in the chat, as well as some additional barriers that we might not immediately think of, but can be real challenges for refugees who are trying to participate in adult education classes. So again, transportation and childcare, I suspect I don't need to tell anyone on this call that those can be barriers. It can be hard to get to classes, whether or not clients are relying on public transit. It can simply be difficult to get there, and I think we all recognize the real challenges that securing regular, affordable childcare in order for an adult family member to take time out of their schedule and attend a class. Those are barriers that we're pretty familiar with. And so we'll talk a little bit more in just a moment about some ways that we can address those barriers. Thank you everybody for the continued responses coming in. We appreciate that. We'll hopefully touch on a few of those in just a minute. I wanted to flag some additional barriers as well that, again, I think, we don't always necessarily think of these top of mind when we're sitting down with a client and maybe working on that first service plan, or perhaps if you're an adult education provider and you're thinking about some of the challenges that students in your class might have in attending those classes consistently. But I wanted to flag a few of these because I think that they are important for us to think about and understand. The first one that we see up there, unpredictable work schedules. So, again, I think as many folks on this call realize, refugees often start working very early in their resettlement period, which is an important step for them to make as they move towards economic independence and self-sufficiency, and as they begin to integrate into their communities. However, that can present some challenges in accessing adult education and ongoing skill building, in part because not only are refugees working, but many of them, their first job is going to be one that is perhaps shift work, maybe has a very unpredictable schedule. I think, again, many of us are familiar with refugee clients who perhaps are accustomed to getting their work schedule maybe just 2 or 3 days in advance, and it changes quite a bit. And so it's kind of that double-edged challenge of not only are they working, right? So they're occupied for perhaps 40 or more hours a week, but it's the fact that they don't have much consistency in knowing when they're going to be off and when they're going to be working that can be particularly challenging in committing to attending an adult education program of some kind. So really wanted to flag that it's not just that they're working, it's that unpredictable nature of the work schedules of many refugees, particularly in those first jobs. Another challenge that you might have encountered with your clients is that they aren't necessarily testing in at the level necessary for the class that they want to take. So for example, maybe in your community, your local adult school offers a vocational ESL program that's combined with a certified nursing assistant or CNA program. And you might have a client who's pretty interested in that program. Many of these programs will require an assessment test at the beginning, and perhaps the challenge for the client who's interested in attending this is that they don't quite test at the right level. Maybe they don't have a high enough score in order to enroll in that program. And so again, that might serve as a barrier to them. They've identified a program that they'd like to participate in, but their skill level is such that they're just not eligible yet to participate in that program. A third factor that you might see in your community is really this question of whether or not there's capacity in the programs that your refugee clients want to participate in. So a lot of adult school programs might have wait lists for certain types of classes, particularly those that might include occupation-specific training and in-demand occupations, the types of programs that might live within your continuing technical education programming. And that can be challenging for clients who, again, they're interested in participating in a class. Perhaps it's even a free class. Maybe they're able to overcome the transportation barriers, but it is not uncommon for those classes to have pretty significant wait lists. I have the good fortune of having a kind of a national perspective on this, as Meg mentioned at the beginning, through the work that I do at IRC. We're engaged in almost 30 different communities across the U.S. And I can tell you that it is not uncommon to see wait lists that are in the hundreds for some of these programs. And I know that can be a real challenge and a real barrier for adults in actually accessing those programs. Another challenge can be simply program schedule changes. Again, there's a lot of variation here, but some adult schools and other educational providers might set their entire schedule a year in advance. Others might do some scheduling a year in advance, perhaps for things like ESL classes, but special programs maybe that are grant funded or are part of particular industry initiatives, the scheduling on that might change pretty rapidly based on things like instructor availability, funding availability, that kind of thing. And I think that can also be a challenge for adults in accessing those programs as well, if it's hard to know when that program might be offered again or what the schedule looks like for the next 6 months. Lastly, I did want to flag this topic of kind of public charge fears. We won't go into a lot of depth in today's webinar about public charge issues, but for those of you who are not familiar with this topic, within the national conversation that we are currently having about immigration, this question of public charge, which in essence means that an immigrant would be availing themselves of certain types of cash assistance, government-funded cash assistance, and that could potentially negatively impact their ability to apply for certain immigration benefits going forward. This conversation, this dialogue that is happening, while there are still many things that are unsettled about this conversation, decisions that have not yet been made, court challenges, etc., we certainly are seeing, and I have heard from adult education providers across the country, that they have new American and immigrant students that are expressing concern about participating in adult education programs because they are afraid that somehow this might come back to harm them as they apply for immigration benefits in the future. So again, I want to be clear that this is not something that is specifically related to refugees. In fact, refugees are exempt from the public charge issues that are sort of currently at play in the courts. However, that culture and that climate of fear within some of our diverse immigrant communities can sometimes serve as a barrier for individuals feeling comfortable participating in adult education programs. Slide, please. So we want to talk a little bit about strategies to overcome these challenges, right? And we're going to do this by thinking about ways in which we can work with individuals to overcome the barriers that they are facing, and then we're going to have a conversation about ways in which we can think about organizational solutions to some of these barriers, right? So we'll go ahead and get started with individual strategies. And my hope is that for many of you that some of these things are things that you have talked about in your own programs with your own staff, and you might have some ideas, and that some of these are also new ideas for you all to think a little bit about. One of the things that I think we all need to be thinking about is strategies to leverage supportive service funding. And in particular, I know we have many ORR funded organizations on this call today. I think many of those organizations are familiar with the supportive services that that can be provided through those ORR funds, and that certainly is a good strategy. However, I think it is also important to think about other ways in which you might be able to leverage different types of supportive service dollars in order to overcome barriers such as childcare or transportation. In particular, I would encourage you to think about whether there are opportunities to co-enroll your clients, or perhaps they are already co-enrolled in TANF Welfare to Work programming, which offers opportunities for supportive service dollars that can support things like childcare and transportation subsidies. Another option is to think about co-enrollment in SNAP E&T, SNAP Education and Training Programming. which also affords opportunities to pay for supportive service costs for things like transportation for clients. Finally, I would encourage you to think about whether there are opportunities to co-enroll clients in various Department of Labor funded programs, particularly those that fall under the umbrella of Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA programs, as there as well are opportunities to pay for supportive service costs such as childcare and transportation. I think it's particularly important to think creatively about sources of supportive service funding for refugees who have perhaps moved beyond an initial period of resettlement and cash assistance and may not be eligible for robust supportive service payments through some of those traditional refugee-specific funding streams. Another strategy that I think, again, very important across the US, perhaps slightly less so in a few cities such as New York or San Francisco where public transit is very robust, but in many cases, taking the time to think about strategies and interventions that can help a client get their driver's license can be really critical as a support for their ability to continue to attend adult education classes, skill building classes, especially once they are employed, right? Because again, we talked about that juggle. Not only are they working 40 hours or more a week, but there are probably childcare responsibilities. Their schedule might be very unpredictable. That makes it really difficult to rely on public transit. And so, whether you're a resettlement agency or a CBO or an adult school, thinking creatively about strategies to support individuals in getting their driver's education, doing the training that they need to do, and perhaps even accessing an affordable auto loan can really be a key strategy in ensuring that that individual will be able to participate in adult education programming now and in the future. So I would encourage you to think about ways in which your organization, your community might support refugees in getting their driver's license. Next slide, please. All right, so a few others that speak to some of the challenges that we identified a few minutes ago. We talked about how sometimes the challenge is that a particular client might be interested in attending a certain program that maybe has an assessment that that client has to take in advance and they have to achieve a specific score. That can serve as a barrier to clients accessing those programs. And so one strategy you might think about is whether there's an opportunity to offer prep classes or even just opportunities to practice taking some of those common assessment tests like the CASAS or the TABE or the BEST test, whatever is used in your community. I think one of the things I would highlight here in particular is that many refugees might have very limited experience taking these types of standardized tests. And so the first time they do it, it can be very daunting and a little overwhelming. And so sometimes just the opportunity to prep and practice a little bit can help them get comfortable so that they can confidently go in, take that placement test and score, and achieve the score they need in order to participate in that program. Another factor to consider is that these tests are increasingly offered in a computer-based format, and so for refugees who don't have strong digital literacy skills, that can sort of be another barrier and another reason why opportunities to practice taking this type of test can really be helpful. And I would emphasize that those types of opportunities can be delivered, that can happen at a resettlement agency, at another CBO, in an adult school, at a library. This is a type of activity that really can happen in a lot of different contexts. We talked a little bit about how the varying work schedules and getting your schedule short notice can really serve as a barrier to clients accessing programming. And I would say that's particularly true for programs that are cohort based and require consistent attendance over a period of time, as compared to, for example, maybe drop-in ESL classes at a library where it's okay if you sometimes come and other times you don't. A lot of those cohort based programs, though, you really do have to have consistent attendance in order to engage in the appropriate learning and potentially even earn some type of certification at the end. So for clients who really are struggling with that, I would encourage you all to think about ways in which you could coach clients on talking to employers about work schedules. We shouldn't make the assumption that clients necessarily understand the best way to have that conversation with an employer. And so if we can provide coaching on how to have that conversation, how to express, for example, that they're very committed to continuing to stay with their job and be on time and do a good job as an employee, but that they're also investing in themselves and their own skills by attending these additional classes and talking about what needs they might have from a scheduling perspective, whether it's that they consistently need Tuesdays off, or whether it's simply that they would like the opportunity to go to part-time for a period of 6 weeks or 8 weeks, or perhaps it's just that it would be very helpful for them to get their schedule a week in advance instead of 3 days in advance so that they can make appropriate arrangements. But really coaching our clients on how to have that conversation with their supervisors. Lastly, we talked about the public charge issue and that there may be some element of fear and nervousness in immigrant communities around the choice to participate in some type of adult education or training program. And so, in order to address that, I would really encourage you to refer those clients to immigration service providers in your community so that they can get appropriate legal advice on concerns about public charge, right? It really is key that they're getting that advice from an immigration service provider as opposed to from an ESL teacher or something like that, and really make sure that that clients have the opportunity to talk to a professional about any concerns that they might have. Again, particularly if we're talking about refugee clients who do not, who by and large should not be as concerned about public charge, that conversation with an immigration service provider might prove to be kind of a helpful conversation to enable them to feel more comfortable participating in a program if that's what's holding them back right now. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about organizational strategies now. So again, all of the strategies that we just talked about really were strategies that you would employ at the level of the individual client, right? Helping them with different types of supportive service funds or having a conversation or coaching them through a conversation to have with their supervisor. Now we're going to turn our attention to organizational strategies. And I think it's really important to realize that a lot of times when we talk about, okay, what barriers do clients face in accessing a service or in achieving a particular outcome, and how can we overcome those barriers? We sometimes as service providers have a tendency to focus on individual level strategies, right? We say, well, this is an individual barrier. This is a client who can't get to and from school, so we have to get them a bus pass so that they can get to and from school. And those are important things to do. But it's also important that we step back a little bit and think about from the organizational level, what could we do to make our education programs more accessible to the clients that we are trying to serve. So the next few ideas that we're going to talk through here are very much in that vein. The first one that I wanted to highlight is, many of you may know this, I'm sure our adult education providers on the phone know this, but in many cases, adult education classes are actually mobile. So there are opportunities to take that class, whether it's just a basic ESL class or whether it's a vocational ESL class for healthcare workers or whatever it might be, and move that class to a location that helps mitigate childcare and transportation barriers. I have seen adult education classes happening in community centers, in libraries, in community rooms at apartment complexes. So really encouraging you to think creatively about maybe the best way to mitigate something like a transportation barrier is actually to take that whole class and put it into a community location that is more accessible for those clients, right? And so in that case, you have overcome that transportation barrier for 20 people, for example, all at once. Another thing you can think about is building partnerships to offer education and training on site at employer locations. we've talked about how many of the individuals that we might be working with who would be trying to access education and training programs are in fact already working, right? Many of them are working in these low-wage, low-skill jobs, and they're really keen to develop their skills so they can move into higher-skill, higher-wage jobs. And so it's worth exploring partnerships with employers, particularly those that might have a high number of English language learners or a high number of adults who don't have a high school diploma, and explore opportunities to actually offer on-site classes. I have seen this happen across multiple industries, including the hospitality sector, manufacturing, as well as healthcare. So you can think about the employer partners that you work with in your community and perhaps seed an initial conversation about what opportunities might exist to actually bring that training to the clients who are working to their work site. Another thing that you can think a little bit about, and we'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about funding, is to implement more integrated education and training programs at varying levels. For those of you who are very familiar with WIOA Title II funding, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but broadly speaking, that's funding that supports adult education and literacy. There has been a push in recent years to offer more integrated education and training programs, which really are programs that combine basic skills instruction and occupational skills instruction at the same time. It's a very integrated, contextualized model. And so, I'm encouraging you to think about, if you're not very familiar with this, it's a good opportunity to learn about what types of IET programs exist in your community, because those really can serve as a great entry point for refugee English language learners who might need both English language skill development, but also the chance to earn occupational, specific occupational skills, including a certification or a credential. So they're really good at doing that, the IET programs. So if you don't know too much about them, I would encourage you to learn more about them in your community. If you do know about them and you know that you have them in your community, there might be opportunities to explore kind of moving the starting point of those IET programs. So for example, if in your community there are already IET programs that exist to help people prepare for careers in welding, but the challenge is that the assessment score that you need to get into that program is higher than many refugee and English language learners in your community, that would be a good opportunity to have a conversation with those program staff, the resettlement agencies, the community-based organizations that are involved, to really talk about whether there would be an opportunity to kind of build that curriculum backwards a little bit so that folks who have perhaps a slightly lower level of English language are able to access some of those IET programs, because they really are powerful and effective programs. Lastly, and related to that, I would encourage you to explore opportunities to build community-based on-ramps and bridge programs. So in some cases, again, there might be at your local adult school or community college some really terrific training programs, but the challenge might be that refugees and others need a community-based on-ramp to prepare for success in those programs, right? And so the opportunity to participate in kind of a pre-training bridge program that's offered in a community-based location, perhaps provided by a resettlement agency or a community-based organization that serves that refugee and immigrant community, can be a really powerful way to help individuals who might not either feel comfortable or be quite ready to enroll in that formal program that's offered at, for example, a local adult school, an opportunity to kind of slowly on-ramp into that program in a way that makes it accessible to more individuals than those who would just access it directly through the school. So these are all organizational strategies that you, working in partnership with others in your community, can explore in order to increase the accessibility of adult education programs for refugees. Other opportunities, there are many. These are, again, I would really encourage you to kind of reflect upon your own community, reflect upon the conversations that are happening in your community, and see which ones of these might might be something that you could grab onto and take into 2020 and have some initial conversations. So we'll run through a couple more here. I talked briefly before about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Again, this is Department of Labor funding that supports a wide range of job training and education activities. And one of the things that you could explore in your community would be opportunities to foster co-enrollment between what is known as Title I funding and Title II funding. So we don't have time in today's webinar to really get into the weeds on this. So for some of you, you might be familiar with what Title I and Title II are. For others, those are probably very new terms for you. But broadly speaking, for those of you who are familiar with the American Job Centers, the career centers in your communities, typically the career centers are one place where a lot of that Title I funding is happening, and there's a strong focus on helping individuals participate in training as well as be placed in employment. Title II funding tends to have a stronger focus on kind of traditional adult education activities, although it is inclusive of occupation-specific training and training that leads to industry-recognized credentials and things like that. But historically, there has been a little bit of space between those two funding streams, and many communities across the U.S. right now are focused on trying to bring together the activities of their career centers and the activities that are happening in their adult education programs to really have more alignment between those two areas and to support co-enrollment of clients who are both in adult schools as well as receiving services under Title I, which could include that more intensive kind of job placement support and that kind of thing. So I would encourage you to explore that a little more. Again, we don't necessarily have time to get way into the weeds today on that, but certainly if those conversations are happening in your community, I would encourage you to join them. Another strategy that you can think about is if you have grant funding right now in order to support education and training for refugees, one option that you could consider would be to buy, and I kind of put that in quotes, a specific class cohort for your program. And again, this can be a good way to help address some of those transportation and childcare barriers, as well as some of the barriers that might be associated with scheduling when certain classes are offered. So for example, if you were interested in supporting a group of individuals in becoming pharmacy technicians, and you also wanted to ensure that they had some vocational ESL language support, it would be possible in many instances to use some grant funding that you had to buy a dedicated class from a local training provider, a local adult education provider, where you were able to kind of take that group of refugees and put them through that specific training in a way that you're able to have a little bit more control over the schedule of that. You're obviously going to overcome any type of waitlist type issues that might be going on, and in an ideal scenario, you're also able to collaborate more closely on the content of those classes. So that's something you can think about, again, particularly if you're dealing with a lot of waitlist challenges, as well as difficulties with understanding schedules in advance and that type of thing. I would encourage you, I know we have many adult education providers on this call. For those of you who are not adult education providers, it's helpful to know that in communities across the United States, adult education providers tend to collaborate together through various types of consortia, often at the local, regional, and state level. And so I would encourage you, if you are an adult education provider who participates in those consortia and planning conversations, to think about inviting other types of diverse organizations such as resettlement agencies or community-based organizations. Similarly, if you are a resettlement agency or a community-based organization, I would encourage you to explore the conversations that your adult education, your local adult education consortia are having about kind of regional planning about what types of classes and trainings they are going to be offering in the year, 2 or 3 years ahead. It's really good to have that kind of cross-fertilization and conversation happening. Lastly, I would encourage you to think about, again, this is kind of speaks to the public charge issue. Adult education providers certainly can partner with immigration service providers to offer info sessions about public charge. I have seen adult schools that actually have, as part of the orientation session that they have for a particular, for example, vocational ESL program, that they actually have an immigration service provider come to that first orientation where the prospective students are learning all about the class, so that the prospective students can also hear from that immigration service provider and gather the information they need about whether their participation in this program would in any way impact their potential or their future immigration benefits. So again, you know, in a climate where there's a fair amount of fear and uncertainty, sometimes that reassurance can be helpful and can help mitigate the concerns that individuals might have in terms of participating in an education or training program. All right, so I have spoken at you for quite a while now, so I want to take a pause here and hear from you all about some ideas that you have about for overcoming barriers, and in particular, have you helped clients leverage strengths that they have in order to access adult education? Anything that you'd like to share in response to either of those questions, please feel free to take a moment and type it in the chat. All right, so I'm seeing lots of interesting ideas and conversations happening in the chat here, including some questions as well as some wishes around everything from more funding for childcare to GED or high-set curriculum that is ESL based. Some great ideas here about using local library space. That often is a very convenient community location that can help kind of mitigate transportation issues. Hearing about using grant funds to purchase bus passes so that they can attend ESL classes. Absolutely, that can be a good strategy, especially in the beginning. Yeah, hearing more about the real challenges of work schedules and finite funding pools, absolutely. Yeah, please keep those ideas coming in, and a few of these I think we might, some of the questions we might be able to tackle in our Q&A period at the end of this webinar. Thank you for those. Next.
And
Go ahead.
Sorry, no, this is just Meg chiming in. Thank you so much, everyone. And don't forget to send your message to all panelists, all attendees, because that means your colleagues on the call can see your suggestions. So I copied a few that you submitted just to the panelists out. Looks like some of them came in a bit of a block, but I'll continue as Erica continues to present to copy in anything that I saw was sent just to us. So anybody else who's interested can check out their response.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about a collaboration between adult education providers and refugee service providers. And I want to kind of cut into this by sort of sharing with you what might be considered kind of a more traditional view of how these types of collaborations work, and what we're calling kind of a more modern view. I mean, it's a fluid conversation, but just by kind of a way to cut into this conversation a little bit. You know, I think historically, we had a system where the idea was that adult schools provided the education, right? They provided the ESL classes, they provided the training, that type of thing. The role of a refugee service provider was to refer clients, right? I think many of us, especially those of us who've worked in this field for a while, this probably sounds pretty familiar. And then clients either find their own jobs or go to a career center. Obviously, if they were actively engaged in employment services that were being provided by a refugee service provider, they might get support there as well. But it really was a model of relatively siloed, segregated roles. And again, I know there are lots of exceptions out there, but if we were to characterize kind of that traditional view, that was kind of how things were set up. We had these adult schools, we referred refugee service providers would refer clients, and that's kind of how that worked. What I would encourage you to think about is kind of this more modern view of how kind of all of these stakeholders can work together in order to meet the needs of refugee clients. I think first and foremost, it's important to really recognize that high quality adult education can be provided by adult schools and refugee service providers, including other types of community-based organizations that might be serving refugees, and that, you know, that focus on high quality adult education is important, but just really recognizing that that can be delivered by a variety of different stakeholders, right? I think we also, you know, as we've come to learn more about what works and what doesn't, we'll talk a little bit about evidence in a minute, we are increasingly recognizing the importance of community-based on-ramps. This is particularly true in refugee and immigrant communities, that they often do much better if they can start with a trusted community-based organization, whether that's a resettlement agency that has been working with them since they, since they first arrived in the U.S., or another type of CBO or ethnic CBO. Again, the idea that they are a trusted, known in the community organization, that they can serve as a really effective on-ramp to help individuals transition from sort of their initial desire and interest in pursuing education and training and their success in actually attending those types of programs, perhaps at a local adult school or community college. I think, you know, again, really recognizing that job placement is part of this work. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a completely new thing, but I think the prominence of job placement, particularly for those of you who are coming more strictly from an adult education background, where for a long time the focus was on education primarily with kind of a secondary role for job placement. As we have seen changes at the federal policy level, we really are seeing a much stronger integration between what is happening in our adult education system and a focus on job placement specifically. And so I think that's an important thing for us all to recognize. And then I think also, you know, this idea that we are talking about collaboration and partnership among adult education providers, among resettlement agencies, CBOs, perhaps other stakeholders as well, including industry or career centers. And that the goal is to serve the whole client, and we really need to think critically about how we're going to resource that partnership, how we're going to fund that partnership such that everyone is able to deliver the services needed to really support that whole client. So, you know, I think this is a helpful lens to kind of think about what we are striving towards in terms of really good programming going forward. Here is just a few resources that provide some evidence around some of the strategies that we just talked about, as well as kind of what was just presented as sort of the modern view of how to do this work well. How do we make sure that we're collaborating across stakeholders and really delivering responsive programming? I think when the Switchboard staff sends this out later, you'll have a chance to look these up and read for yourself some of the findings that we've had about how to do this work well. So thank you. Next slide. You know, as we transition from kind of this you know, traditional view of, okay, adult schools are going to provide, for example, the ESL classes, refugee resettlement agencies are going to refer clients over, and, you know, that's that, right? That very sort of siloed approach. I think it's really important to recognize that having these conversations in your local community is a process. It's not the kind of thing that happens overnight. I imagine many of you, if you think about the community that you're in and the conversations that are happening around this topic, some of these things may have already come up, but I wanted to just kind of flag a few things, a few strategies that you might think about using if those conversations are already happening in your community, or if you decide to kind of foster those those conversations in the year ahead. So as we have this shift in thinking, it really does require open dialogue among stakeholders. And I think that it is important that everybody approach the conversation with a desire to have that open dialogue. It's critical to keep the conversation client or learner centered. Even that is indicative sometimes of our silos, right? On the resettlement agency side, as well as the CBO side, we often talk about clients. In our adult education partners, we often talk about learners. And so whether you're talking about clients or learners, keeping it really centered on them and being respectful of institutional history in the community. As we kind of think outside the box and think about ways in which we can collaborate and build programs that are really responsive to the needs of our refugee clients, that might require some shifts in roles of what what stakeholder is doing what service or activity. And it's really important that we keep it focused on the client and the learner, but that we're very respectful of the institutional history that all of the partners involved very much have in the community. I think it's also incredibly important to learn about how work is funded across partners and what outcomes must be achieved. If you are an adult education provider, it will be very helpful for you to understand, for example, how are services to refugees funded, particularly around things like education and job placement and that kind of thing, and what kinds of outcomes are those providers trying to achieve for those refugees. Similarly, if you're a resettlement agency or a community-based organization, it will be helpful for you to learn more about how our adult education system is funded and what types of outcomes do learners participating in that system have to achieve. Again, the goal is that everybody learns a little bit about what other stakeholders, how they're resourced and what they're trying to achieve, as a precursor to kind of that conversation about what could we do together that would fit kind of with both our resources and the goals that we're trying to achieve. If you have the opportunity to engage individuals with cross-system expertise, I would highly encourage you to do it. Sometimes it can be tricky to find someone who has that cross-system expertise. Many of us spend a good chunk of our careers just in one system, but if you have the opportunity to engage folks who have experience within, for example, the adult education system, as well as within social services agencies or within the workforce system or some combination of that, in many cases, those individuals can be really helpful in kind of translating across partners and helping think creatively about ways to build programming. Lastly, I would encourage you to start small. I think sometimes, when we are faced with the challenge of trying to rethink how we do our work, it can seem overwhelming and it can seem daunting. And I would really encourage you to think about starting very, very small. Maybe you want to try a specific cohort or program, maybe just for 8 or 10 or 12 individuals, where it's going to be a partnership between a local adult school and a resettlement agency or a community-based organization. And you're going to try that for a 3-month period, a 6-month period, trying to get 8 students or 10 students through a particular program. And then you can take some time after that to evaluate what worked, what didn't work, kind of have that good intensive debrief before thinking about trying to fundamentally change the way that the systems and stakeholders and partners in your communities work together. You can learn a lot by starting small. All right, so our last section for today is going to focus a little bit on funding. And again, in the context of this webinar, we are not going to go into great depth on any of these. I know our Switchboard staff will share out at the end that they are always available for ongoing technical assistance support. But I wanted to flag just a few things as you start thinking about how might we fund some really innovative adult education programs in our community. And I know I saw it in several of the comments in the chat where people were saying, well, funding is limited, we don't have funding, how can we get funding? So I know funding is always top of mind for everybody. Certainly, I think many of you are very familiar with the funding that comes through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and so I would encourage you to think about the resources that you get if you are a recipient of or our funds in that way. Think about the ways in which you can use those resources to support innovative adult education. Particularly in areas like vocational ESL, I think there are opportunities there. We've talked a little bit about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, including both Title II funding and Title I funding. Again, in the broadest terms, Title II funding is the funding that supports adult education and literacy. Title I funding supports more of the intensive career services that are provided to individuals who are underemployed or unemployed. Both of those are absolutely opportunities to fund adult education programs. I would flag for you in particular, if you are interested in looking a little bit more at what opportunities exist under Title II, I would encourage you to look at the sections that focus on integrated education and training, which we talked a little bit about, as well as Section 243 funding, which is also a focus on integrated education and training, but has the added component of having a focus on English language learners and civics as well. So again, we don't have time in the context of this webinar to go into great depth, but in terms of giving you some markers to take a look at and explore more, those would be good places to look. I think many of you are familiar with SNAP E&T. These funds can be used to support a wide range of education and training activities for individuals who are receiving SNAP and are SNAP E&T eligible. Without going into great detail, typically individuals are going to be SNAP E&T eligible if they are not also enrolled in TANF programming. So it's kind of an either or thing. But SNAP E&T funding is actually supporting quite a number of very innovative skills training programs for refugees and English language learners across the country. Washington State was one of the kind of earlier adapters of this type of programming specifically for English language learners and refugees. And so there are real opportunities to use those funds to support programs in your area. Some of you might be familiar with Community Development Block Grant funding. This funding is federal funding that is typically allocated at the local or municipal level in your community. You might have heard it referred to by its acronym of CDBG. These funds can also be used to support skill building and job training programs, among many other things. They're not limited to supporting that, but that might be an opportunity for you as well to explore a funding source that could support job training, skill building, and adult education programs for refugees and others in your community. For those of you who are interested in programs that are specifically focused on helping people prepare for careers in allied healthcare, including things like contextualized medical vocational ESL, as well as certification and credential programs, you can take a look at the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA. They also have funding opportunities for that type of programming. Lastly, and this varies tremendously by state, but there are various types of state level training funds that are available. Sometimes they are levies from particular taxes or kind of pulled together in different ways, but they're not federal pass-through, they're state specific. And so it can be valuable to explore the opportunities that exist in your state to support this type of work. Great. I'm going to transition it over to Meg and let her finish us up.
Great, thanks so much, Erica. We have a few minutes for Q&A, but before we get to it, I wanted to flag Erica's done a great job today in just reviewing a few recommendations for common barriers, but there's of course many more, many that you already typed out in the chat, or other ideas that might be relevant for your particular program, your context, your clients. So I want to refer you all to the information guide that Switchboard has put together called Overcoming Barriers in Adult Education, Strengths-Based Strategies for Effective Enrollment and Retention. And that is a longer document that covers a lot of the suggestions Erica gave today, but also gives other ideas, you know, under transportation or childcare or different barriers that your clients might be encountering. Erica also referenced TA or technical assistance from Switchboard. So you can go on the Switchboard website, switchboardta.org, and submit a request for support with your particular program at any time. So if anything that you heard today sounds interesting, you want to hear more, or you have other ideas, other questions that we didn't cover, send them our way, and we'd be very happy to help you with TA. And then you'll get a list of links to external resources in an email. It'll come from, I believe, me via Zoom, but in any case, that'll be in 24 hours, and we'll include the studies Erica mentioned, this document, the recording to the webinar, and a few other materials that we thought might be interesting to you. So do keep an eye out for that. So I think we'll move now into Q&A, and I did see several questions come in, Erica, over the webinar. So as people are typing out new ones, do go ahead and do that. What questions do you all have? Go ahead and type them in. Why don't we start with a question received earlier, which was, what strategies can you recommend to keep individuals engaged in classes, in particular ESL classes, after they start working?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one that I'm guessing almost all of us on this call are very familiar with. I think a few of the strategies that we talked about earlier are particularly helpful here. So I would really encourage you to explore opportunities to bring ESL classes to workplaces that have a high number of English language learners. I mean, if you just kind of think a little bit about the ways in which that mitigates the barriers to attend, if attending ESL class is a matter of, showing up an hour early to work or staying an hour, after your shift, as opposed to having to, get in the car and drive to another location and attend class and arrange for childcare and those types of things. Some of those organizational level strategies really can help motivate individuals to participate in ESL, not because we're giving them some individual incentive to keep attending ESL classes, but because we are actually making it easier for working adults to attend those classes. So I'd very much encourage you to explore those types of partnerships. Similarly, we talked about the strategy of kind of the mobility of adult education classes. So if there are opportunities to have some conversations with your adult school, or if you are an adult school and you want to explore possibilities to bring ESL classes into other community-based locations, whether that's a local elementary school, whether that's a community room in a large apartment complex, those too can be really good strategies to just make it easier for adults who are working to continue to attend ESL classes.
Great, thanks, Erica. We got another question from Anka, who asks, explains a bit about their program and says, we've noticed that when sending our clients to career centers to get vouchers for training programs, they face the barrier of not having a U.S. high school diploma. Do you have recommendations for how programs can advocate for their clients in that situation?
Absolutely. That is I think a common challenge for those of you who have worked with your local AJC and trying to help clients access those training vouchers. You might have encountered that before. I think a couple things that I would share with you is, one is, in many cases, the requirement to have a GED or high school diploma in order to access that training voucher is not actually dependent on the AJC having a rule about needing a high school diploma, but rather it might be a prereq or requirement of whatever training program that they are trying to access. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is to have a conversation with your AJC staff to figure out, is the issue that that the AJC itself has implemented a rule where in order to access training dollars, you have to have a high school diploma, or is it simply that the program that that person is interested in, let's say a dental assistant program or whatever, has that requirement? Because in many cases, you can kind of parse that out a little bit, and you might be able to advocate for a client to receive that training voucher so long as you can show that they're going into a program that doesn't require as a prereq that that individual has a high school diploma. So I'd encourage you to to have that as kind of a first conversation, and go from there.
All right, thanks for that. We'll maybe take one or two more questions to allow a little bit of time to complete our feedback survey before the end of the hour. I did see a question from Therese, who asked about on-site childcare. So Erica, I know you spoke a bit about different strategies to alleviate that barrier, but have you seen examples of childcare being provided on-site in the context of adult education?
So yes, there certainly are examples of childcare being provided on site. I would say that the most common example of that I have seen is actually where there is co-location of adult education classes and some other type of childcare program, like a Head Start program, for example. So it's not that the adult school is sort of on the side providing childcare services, but rather through strategic co-location, whether that's with a Head Start site, or perhaps it's at a local elementary school that offers, pre-K or other types of childcare, that they're able to offer childcare to participants through that strategic co-location, as opposed to kind of that adult education provider themselves providing childcare. The other thing I will say is there certainly are some community-based organizations that provide that are, education and training providers. So it might be a CBO that is offering vocational ESL classes or something like that. And that CBO might also have some sort of a child watch program, whether that's a volunteer-led program or a staff-led program, and that program in many cases would probably be resourced through other grant funds. So that would be an option to explore as well. But I think the most common strategy and the most sustainable strategy is really thinking strategically about co-location of classes at places where childcare is already being provided.
All right, so I see we're about at the end of our time. Thank you so much again, Erica, for your thoughtful responses to the Q&A. If there are other questions, again, you have Switchboard's information right here to reach out to us, and we'd love to stay in touch. One thing I can really plug is we have a feedback survey. It is less than 30 seconds. I would so appreciate if anyone attending can take that feedback survey. The link should actually already be open in your browser for those of you who joined via Zoom, and that will come via the email as well tomorrow. So that's hugely helpful to us to improve our trainings in the future and really make sure they're relevant to the information that you need when you're serving your clients. So thank you again so much, everyone, for taking some time out of your day to join us. You have our contact information in case you'd like to stay in touch. And I'll also say a huge thank you to Erica for facilitating today.